Hello everyone, today let's talk about Iran's serious strategic weaknesses, and whether they can actually protect their nuclear facilities is a key issue. Also, according to US media, Trump has been repeatedly disrespected by China, Israel, and Russia. How to avoid going to war with Iran is the most troublesome problem. Without President Trump, the troubles just won't stop. According to a CNN report on June 16, Trump was eager to end the Russia-Ukraine conflict but hit a wall, and after launching a tariff trade war against China, he ended up backing down out of fear. He's almost being dragged into the water by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, getting pulled into participating in a war against Iran. Trump's foreign policy is falling apart, as he's been repeatedly disrespected by Russia, China, and even Israel. CNN even thinks so. This Iran crisis might end up defining the success or failure of Trump's second term. Earlier, just before the hope for nuclear talks with Iran, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu was halting a large-scale attack on Iran, having already killed 2 of Iran's top generals, senior officials, and a large number of Iranian nuclear scientists. Iran suffered heavy losses and, in anger, pulled out of negotiations with the US. After that, Iran and Israel kept launching large-scale missile attacks against each other. Trump tacitly approved Israel's actions, but as the situation quickly worsened, he found himself in a dilemma. With no solution at home, Trump was facing mounting pressure. Because traditional Republicans believe that if there's no way to force Iran to give up its nuclear ambitions through diplomacy, the US might have no choice but to intervene militarily in this conflict. However, right-wing supporters of the America First movement were all urging Trump to hold back, stick to their isolationist stance, and absolutely avoid getting involved in a new Middle East war. And, according to CNN, who are considered Trump's core supporters, both from the perspective of US national security and domestic political factors, it's clear that in this so-called life-or-death battle declared by Israel, the wise position for the US is to stay out of the conflict with Iran. However, there are some powerful forces that might push the US to get even more deeply involved in the conflict, rather than just simply providing Israel with weapons for defense like they are doing now, according to 2 sources familiar with the matter as reported by Reuters earlier. Trump has already rejected Israel's request to the US to assassinate Iran's supreme leader Khamenei. However, how the situation develops is not necessarily something Trump can control. On June 14, according to 2 Israeli officials cited by US RCO News Network, Israel, within the past 48 hours, has asked the Trump administration to join a war against Iran in order to destroy its nuclear program. But so far, Trump has kept his distance from Israel's actions. If Iran attacks US military bases and personnel in the region, or targets belonging to the US anywhere in the world, Washington would have no choice but to respond forcefully. In addition, if Iran tries to pressure Trump by attacking international shipping in places like the Red Sea, forcing Israel's hand, it could also trigger a global energy crisis. For Trump, getting involved in the conflict is the most dangerous option. According to CNN, Trump is extremely cautious about the US getting drawn into this military conflict because it is full of risks. It could lead to the conflict expanding beyond the current battlefield and might trigger a brutal war with no clear end in sight. This is the worry about war. If there are any lessons to be learned from the early years of this century, it's that the White House's war objectives and its analysis of Middle East goals have almost always ended in disastrous mistakes. The fall of Saddam's regime and the situation in Syria both show this clearly. What if a power vacuum appears in either of the 2 countries where the US president is involved? The country could easily spiral out of control and split apart, and then the US would have to keep up military intervention. But if they don't step in, the current situation would undermine the core principles of Trump's America First movement. After going through more than a decade of hardship in Iraq and Afghanistan, the US should really stay away from foreign quagmires. If they get involved in another prolonged war, it's obviously completely at odds with that vision. The top officials and hawks in Washington might insist that if Trump is faced with a golden opportunity to cut off Iran's path to developing nuclear weapons, or even help overthrow the country's regime, he should take it. According to CNN, the US president could make use of this. It's common to see memoirs mention the major and painful decisions made about deploying troops in overseas wars. However, sometimes the most tempting option is to take action yourself, and it also takes courage to make the tough decision not to send in troops. Especially for Trump. The situation Trump is facing now is that deciding to intervene usually leads to negative consequences. Some say that in the US nowadays, Trump can no longer just stand by and watch. The political pressure is getting higher and higher, and Trump is facing a complicated dilemma. So Israel's attacks have only managed to eliminate several senior Iranian military leaders and nuclear scientists, but it's still unclear whether Israel actually has the capability to completely destroy Iran's nuclear program. Don't be Shanghai Ren's deputy. Up ahead is Vice President Pence. On June 15, a CNN program said that if Israel can't somehow force Iran to make major concessions in the Trump administration's ongoing diplomatic negotiations, there won't be unlimited happiness. The US should also be prepared for military intervention. Some believe that if Israel needs the US to ensure the physical destruction of Iran's nuclear program, the US must be ready, because this is to protect its most genuine ally. And Trump's close ally, Republican Senator Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, believes that if a conflict breaks out between Israel and Iran, the worst possible outcome would be that Tehran's nuclear capability continues to exist. Right? If I can't succeed now, the only option left is force. He would urge President Trump to go all out to make sure that after the operation, there's no trace left of Iran's nuclear program. If that means providing bombs, then provide bombs. If it means carrying out airstrikes together with Israel, that means bombing together. Even though there are some people in the US beating the war drums, there are also different voices trying to stop it. For example, Republican Congresswoman Marjorie Greene, the radical group Turning Point USA's Charlie Kirk, and even the well-known news anchor Tucker Carlson, all of them are famous Trump supporters and die-hard MAGA fans. It can be said that the reason voters support Trump is because they don't want the US to get involved in foreign conflicts, right? The loudest voices among working Americans have already warned Trump that if the US gets dragged into a new war in the Middle East, it will damage the trust between him and the core supporters of the America First movement. Mr. Trump and his team have always been extremely cautious when it comes to their complex coalition of supporters, and are unwilling to take any actions that might anger the public. After returning to power, Trump has vowed to become what he calls a peacemaker. He used to have a very optimistic attitude towards healthcare issues, but the current situation clearly isn't what he wanted to see. CNN has been relentless in its criticism, saying that 5 months after Trump returned to the White House, these problems still exist. The two main conflicts have now become even worse. The dangerous confrontation between Israel and Iran is the biggest test yet for the America First policy. In the end, no matter how much I want to avoid conflict, the chaos in the Middle East is inevitable. If the way things have developed has already exposed how shallow Trump's self-perceived abilities are, then the so-called art of the deal in his foreign policy as president has been a failure. The worsening crisis may signal that, in a world lacking stable and consistent leadership, things will only become even more turbulent. To sum up, first, apart from Iran's nuclear facilities that are deeply buried underground, Israel has no way to destroy them. It would require the US to have those kinds of advanced bunker-busting capabilities. Second, there has not been any direct military intervention, so they can't really cut you off. Trump wanted to avoid this at all costs, but could he really dodge it? Third, from China's perspective, if the Middle East and Ukraine issues are resolved, then the focus will shift to the Asia-Pacific. On the contrary, the US is still deeply stuck in the Middle East. For China, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Besides, Iran is also caught in a passive, defensive position in this conflict. Among them, a commentator from mainland China's Observer Network, Major General Eugene, gave a good analogy, mentioning Peter Drucker, the father of modern management. He talked about the barrel theory. In the West, old wooden barrels are made up of several vertical wooden staves bent and held together by metal hoops to form a barrel. But how much water the barrel can hold doesn't depend on the tallest stave, but rather on the shortest one. Because the water will leak out from above the shortest stave. There are two issues: too many short staves, and under the attacks of high-level precision strikes by the leadership, casualties are inevitable. This is because there are spies inside the country who leak the whereabouts of commanders. Israel claims that this operation received support and assistance from over 1,300 Iranian opposition members. That number might just be for publicity, but it's likely that the number of spies inside Iran is far from just a handful. Of course, the intelligence agencies of Iran's Revolutionary Guard can also obtain key information about Israel's critical nuclear facilities and even the storage sites for nuclear weapons. Israel is likely able to pinpoint the locations where Iran's military leadership holds meetings, but there is a difference between the two. But who actually has the capability to strike? Iran doesn't have that capability, while Israel basically does. Iran's fighter jet fleet is outdated and its defensive power is almost non-existent. Once the border early warning radars and air defense missile systems in Iran are completely taken out by Israel's FPV suicide drones and Spike anti-tank missiles within just a few minutes, there's no way to avoid a situation where Iran's air and space defenses are left wide open. Both of these defense forces have the same problem as Russia: they're not sufficient, not strong enough, and not smart enough to face Israel's strategy, which involves over 200 fighter jets led by F-35 stealth fighters launching repeated attacks. Even Russia couldn't hold them off, let alone Iran. Iran's missiles are relatively strong, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has the largest and most comprehensive ballistic missile arsenal in the entire Middle East, most of which is hidden in massive underground bunkers. This gives their ballistic missile system a fair amount of protection, but as for the missile system itself, there's also a kind of fatal flaw. Iran may have a full range of ballistic missile weapons, but most of them are liquid-fueled missiles. And among those that can actually reach Israeli territory, almost all of them are liquid-fueled missiles. Liquid-fueled missiles need to be moved by missile launch vehicles to the firing position, and only after that can they be fueled and launched. This process takes a long time and is very dangerous. Once exposed, it's easy to get hit by enemy missiles. Unless at the very beginning of the war, when the air defense system is paralyzed and suppressed by electronic warfare. The Iranian ballistic missile launch vehicles that left their shelters to counterattack at the very first moment also came under heavy attack, resulting in 4 launch vehicles being destroyed while on the move, and 1 launch vehicle was destroyed just as it was about to leave the shelter. On the other hand, you could say that the Revolutionary Guard had no way to reorganize the command system to launch an attack again, which led to repeated delays in their counterattack. Most of Iran's missile silos and underground missile bases were still safe and could be put into battle. But the problem is, after Iran's main commanders were killed, probably no one dared to make the decision to use these weapons, because once they're exposed, they'll lose their deterrent effect in the future and become the top targets in the next war. Iran's potential enemies aren't just limited to Israel. Israel doesn't have the capability to destroy Iran's large underground missile bases, but the Americans do. If the US sends B-2 bombers over one day and drops heavy bunker buster bombs on these underground facilities, that would be a different story. So what does Iran have to rely on? Basically, it all depends on how the Americans act. This is what you call being caught in a dilemma. Do you really want to use your ultimate weapon to deal with a threat that might not even be the most deadly? The conclusion is, Iran has too many weak points. There are leaks everywhere, so China should take this as a warning and work on fixing all its own weaknesses. Second, Israel is making a big push, basically trying to force everything underground. Iran's missile bases keep getting extended, and now Iran faces a dilemma: should they reveal themselves or not? Third, Iran's kind of strength is actually a temptation for the United States. But back then, after the US fought in Afghanistan, which was much weaker than Iran, they still ended up fleeing in defeat. Starting a war seems like a lose-lose situation for the US again. Hello everyone. Besides having videos on YouTube, Bastille Post also has videos on another platform, SEK Lao Toy. SEK Lao Toy offers a lot of exclusive content, especially news and current affairs analysis about China that I, Luk Sheng, produce. Creating this content requires a lot of resources, so I hope you'll support Bastille Post by subscribing to SEK Lao Toy. With your support, we can keep making more content. Thank you, everyone.